All right, I'll try to be quick because today's video is a little bit longer than usual, and I want to hopefully try to keep a little bit of time at the end for just some practice. But to begin, last week we talked about the third application of the Columbo tactic.
Do you want sides going behind you?
Is it not?
There you go.
There we go.
Oh. What have we done?
Way to go, Nicole.
Somehow this is my fault, okay? Always.
Just please don't help anymore.
There we go. Okay.
Oh yeah, I forgot they had that on there.
Oh, Hector's, yeah.
We gotta go get popcorn.
So does anybody remember what the third application of the Columbo tactic is? The first one is asking a question, what do you mean by that? The second one is, how did you come to that conclusion? The third one's a little more complicated. Last week we talked about the third application of Columbo. It's not a specific question, it's more of a...
Put it back on them? Or why do you believe that?
That's the second.
Oh.
The second application is how did you come to that conclusion? So that's reversing the burden of truth.
Third is asking questions leading to a conclusion.
Exactly. And that's probably the most difficult because you have to actually know what you're trying to get at, right? You know, asking leading questions to arrive at a conclusion is kind of tricky. But it's helpful because it gets the other person to put pieces on the table that you can use to guide them
I used it this week.
toward the conclusion.
Did you?
Nice.
Mormons, yeah.
What does that look like? Did you say with Mormons?
Yeah.
Did they come to your door?
Yeah, I invited them over yesterday. It was fun.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
I can just picture they like ring your doorbell and like, do you have a moment to speak about our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ? And Randy's like, yeah, what do you want to know?
We pre-scheduled it. We pre-scheduled it, so I had a lot of time, so I had all kinds of stuff.
Nice. Nice,
They're
dude.
scared to ring my doorbell.
All right, so the next one is what are the key ways to finding a flaw in the other person's view? Anybody remember that?
Well, you can smell it. BS can always be smelled.
It's kind of a trick question because there isn't really a special formula. The key is just listening and paying careful attention to what they're saying so that you can identify the pieces that they have put onto the table.
I probably got a lot of that. What did the Mormons tell you that was that? There was a flaw in there. Did they tell you?
Oh, their response to it?
Yeah.
Oh, that God uses humans to write everything, all their stuff down in the Book of Mormon and everything, and humans make mistakes. And even the angel Moroni in the Book of Mormon says, why do you use us in our language and they have so many errors and mistakes? So it's justification for all the contradictions.
Interesting.
Self-defeating, but
Toward the end, we talked about working on improving your Columbo skills. Does anybody remember? There were three words really, like three verbs that Greg talked about for practicing and improving your Columbo skills.
That was a week ago. Let me see. Verbs, you said?
Mm-hmm.
Anybody remember what verbs are? Sentence structure? They don't teach that anymore.
The first one was anticipate. You want to anticipate the objections and questions that someone might have. The second one was reflect, and that was one that Colin had talked about, where reflecting on these ideas and just thinking about playing it out in your head. Greg talked about doing this while he's in the car driving. Like he'll literally talk to himself while he's driving and kind of practice these conversations. And the third one was practice. Practice new questions and potential responses out loud, maybe while you're driving. And then the last one is what are two steps that you can do to defend against when someone uses the Columbo on you? So if somebody starts using Columbo against you and they're asking you leading questions, how can you defend against that?
Well, you talked about just stopping the conversation.
That's the first one.
Recognizing what's going on.
Yep.
And acknowledging it, and rather than being led.
Mm-hmm.
Or you can tell them to explain it. You're not quite understanding what they're saying, and you'll take notes.
Yep, exactly. So first, stop the advance, and then second, say something along the lines of it sounds like you're trying to make a point with your questions. Instead, could you just make your point and then allow me to respond to it, right? So now we'll get started with the video.
Hi, I'm Greg Hochul for Stand to Reason, and welcome back to our tactics training. This is our fourth session together, and next time we get together, we'll talk about another way that arguments go bad. I call that way taking the roof off, and we'll describe that tactic next time we're together. See you then.
All right. So it's 11:38. We've got just a few minutes, but I thought maybe we could walk through some of these. One that I found kind of interesting in the study guide that Greg talks about is this statement: "You are what you eat." So let's kind of unpack that a little bit. So the suicide tactic is looking for how an argument contradicts itself and completely undermines its own validity, right? So let's take this statement: "You are what you eat." What's wrong with that?
How can you be if you've eaten it?
Well, what are you before you've eaten it?
Right.
Well, if they are, like the Donner Party, then you can say that, right? So
Yeah. I
there's a
suppose-
limited range where that is true.
You can feed your brain by what you take in visually or read. So it depends on what part of your body. I mean, what we physically eat with our mouths, can make us fat or skinny or get a disease, but what you read and take in and feed your mind makes implications on your judgment calls and your morality.
Yeah, there's kind of an implicit presumption that's being made, right? Like, if you are what you eat, doesn't that make a presumption about what you are, namely, what eats? What part of us eats? Because you were talking about what you take into your mind, but is that really eating? Or is that just consuming information? Eating is physical, right? So I think the presumption of this statement, "you are what you eat," is that you're nothing more than your body. Well, that's problematic, isn't it?
Guess you'd have to ask the person, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, sounds like a figure of speech.
Yeah, like if you eat too much garlic, you're gonna smell like garlic.
Are you
That
literally
you
garlic?
are garlic, yeah.
That's what we tell you about.
Here's one. I've actually had this used on me. We've talked about it a little bit, but has anybody ever had this said to them? "That's true for you, but that's not true for me." You ever been talking to somebody and they're like, "Well, sure, that's true for you, but that's not true for me."
I've heard it this way: you be you, and I'll be me.
Why do you think someone might say, "Well, that's true for you, but that's not true for me"?
Why would they say that?
Yeah, why would somebody say that?
Because they have no better response.
They feel backed into a corner. Yeah. It kind of sounds like a showstopper, doesn't it? Because it's just like they're drawing a line and they're just like, "Okay, I give up. That's true for you, but that's not true for me."
But it's a contradiction in the definition of what true is.
Right. It's more or less the same as saying, "Well, there is no truth.
Yeah.
There's no truth."
Well, we
Second
can
one.
agree to disagree.
Yeah, I think
lot
that
too.
that might be more of like an extension of an olive branch. Like, I just don't want to talk about this anymore.
Yeah, right.
But let's try to practice the suicide tactic on this statement. "That's true for you, but that's not true for me." How can you use the suicide tactic on this? How can you apply it to itself?
Well, ask them to define true. What do you mean by truth, or what do you mean by true?
Yeah,
It's the first step.
I mean, consider. Well, is that true for both of us, or is that only
Right.
true for you?
You might ask them, "Do you mean what you say?"
Yeah.
Because if you don't mean it, then we don't need to talk about it.
Is that true? Or is that true just for you?
Yeah. Sometimes it's kind of pernicious. I don't have an example of the sibling rivalry suicide, but this one's kind of more pernicious because it's not immediately obvious how it self-refutes. But has anybody ever seen or heard the question, "Well, can God create a rock too heavy for himself, even he himself, to lift?"
Or can God sin?
Right.
Right? Can God sin? Exactly.
I'll
That's a
just sing the song,
self-contradictory
He has the whole
question.
world in his hands.
Yeah.
So
Big rock.
what's the problem with this question? What's the problem with What's the
It's-
problem with can God sin?
I
What's
think
the
it's
problem with that?
beyond our purview. We assume based off of what we've been given that he can't, and that he can't, and that's based off of our understanding that there's limitations based on his ability to do that.
Well, I think there are certain presumptions that you're making about the word can.
Well, I kind of know the answer to this because we've talked about
it.
But you're asking if a man can be a woman. You're asking if a rock can be a fish. You're asking if a definition of something can contradict itself.
Can God create a married bachelor?
Right.
But then you have paradoxes. you
Right,
know.
that's exactly what it is. It's a paradox. It's
Yeah.
a self-refuting
I mean,
statement.
can-
It
The whole
commits
idea of
suicide.
Trinity to begin with. We accept it, and we accept it, and yet we can't really understand any more than we can understand about it. It is what it is, and we accept it, but in our finite form, we can't really understand much more than it is what it is. I mean, we can understand things about it,
Mhm.
but sit there and say, oh yeah, that makes sense. It only makes sense tangentially, because everything else speaks against it.
Well, I would say the Trinity is a different topic, and maybe one that we could talk more about. But I don't think that the Trinity is self-refuting in the same way that can God create a rock too heavy for himself to
The
lift?
two things I see is that most people, when they say stuff, I have to ask every word, like what you're doing. Do you mean what you mean? What do you mean by that? What do you mean by that? Because I don't think they're really saying the way it's hitting my ear, Because when it hits my ear, it doesn't sound like it makes sense.
Mhm.
To sit here and go, you don't believe in anything? You know what I mean?
Yeah,
How do you not
yeah.
believe in anything?
Yeah,
And how would you not know unless you know everything?
right.
Well, to me, it means, does God have limits?
Exactly.
question.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Exactly. So really what it's doing is it's challenging omnipotence. And omnipotence isn't about what God can and can't do, because God can't create a married bachelor. He can't create a square circle. It's not that God lacks the power to do those things. It's just that the supposed task is nonsense. So asking, can God create a rock too heavy for himself to lift, would be no more valid a question than can God well, what does that mean? It doesn't mean anything. So what difference does it make if God can It's just gibberish. It's nonsense. But it's pernicious because it seems right. It seems like it makes sense. But when you really take it apart and you take the roof off, which is what we'll talk about next week, you can see that it's nonsense. It's just gibberish. So it doesn't matter if God can or can't do it because it's nonsense. So the challenge is that it's trying to create, God can't win, because if God can create a rock too heavy, then he can't lift it. But if God can't create a rock so heavy that he can't lift, then he can't create a rock. So it's paradoxical because it's trying to presuppose limitations on God's power, but the truth of the matter is that omnipotence isn't about what God can or can't do within the confines of logic.
Yeah, I like the logic and the limitation word, because as I parse over it and I think about it, I sit there and I think, well, once again, it's all language and we're doing our best with what we got, but he could make something that doesn't make sense until it changes states again and then makes sense, and that wouldn't make any sense to us. But yeah, as far as what we're talking about, thresholds, logic for us, yeah.
Well, see, here's where I've arrived on that. When I've asked myself the question, what is logic that God obeys it? Is it something that is above God? No, the answer is no. It's just like the question, can God sin? Logic is something that is part of God's nature. So God can't contradict himself, because then he wouldn't be God. God can't not be God. So to sin would be to be not God. So can God be not God? Can Colin not be Colin? No.
Yeah. So, what was I gonna say? So as I look up words, and I looked up science, and people say can't prove science, and I'm looking at etymology and trying to figure out how I'm looking at it. I saw some words. One of us said that science comes from a word like sire, not like siring children, but sire as to like scissors, to cut open, to look inside, to know. It doesn't necessarily extract like to measure from, but you can glean that if you're looking with your eyes, you're using some kind of, measurement tools. So it almost seems to me like science is just based off of observation and knowledge. It's not necessarily even metric beyond establishment, you know?
Yeah, scientific truth is a contradictory phrase.
Right. How can you prove that science is true scientifically? You can't. You just have to make presumptions.
The best that it can do is create inferences based on its evidence.
Right.
The statement itself is a philosophical statement.
Exactly
So you
right.
can't be philosophical and then
Exactly
you just
right.
defeated yourself.
Exactly
Right.
right.
It's
So-
interesting, when he was talking, it reminded me of Hugh Hewitt, the radio talk show host, but he's also worked in the Reagan Justice Department and assistant solicitor general. And it's interesting, he was just famous for doing interviews, and he would use these tactics to just, one of his favorite sayings is, if you're stuck in a hole, stop digging.
Yeah.
Because
I like that.
he would take people's claims and just show how they're self-defeating, self-contradictory.
Yeah.
And it was just amazing to watch. Brilliant man, and just using these techniques and his interviews, and a perfect example of that.
Yeah, so the suicide tactic is looking for ways, trying to identify ways in which these arguments are self-refuting or self-defeating or contradictory with each other. Like with sibling rivalry, you can't have two mutually exclusive beliefs, which you can imagine would be immensely frustrating for the person that you're talking to if you're pointing out these flaws in their argument. And of course, as ambassadors for Christ, you want to be genial, you want to be friendly, you want to be gentle. So, be mindful of that kind of thing. So this week we talked about the suicide tactic, which is identifying those problems. Next week we're talking about taking the roof off, which is using that information to gently guide them toward realizing that their ideas are self-refuting. Right. So just as a quick reminder, all of the video that we watched today, sorry for the technical difficulties. I think it might be the cable, because I noticed at one point when Colin bumped the table, it cut out the audio. So I think it might be this cable. But anyway, the whole video is on defendersapologetics.org. I do have self-assessments that are like quizzes. I mean, you don't have to take it or pass or fail or anything, but if you want to go on there and practice and refresh your memory on that, just want to encourage you to avail yourselves of that. And would anybody like to pray us out? Thanks, Scott.
Dear God, we just thank you for this time. We just pray that you would help us to be mindful of these things, to be just aware of ways that we can be persuasive for you, ways that we can be sensitive to other people's emotions, and yet help them to go beyond that, to look at the logic of their claims, also to assess our own views and see where we have contradictions in our own lives and in our own thinking, that we might be clear-minded, and in that way serve you better. And, just thank you for John, and just for this class, and just for the information that it's bringing to us. And just pray this all through Christ. Amen.
Thanks,
I
Scott.
got a question for you.
Sure.
Does everything